Bon, eh bien, bonjour à ceux qui nous rejoignent. Donc, on va continuer nos sessions. Cette session, enfin non, celle-ci, on va la commencer. Hein. On était sur de l'open science tout à l'heure. Maintenant, on va être plutôt sur de la souveraineté. Et donc, on va avoir une table ronde sur la souveraineté numérique dans l'Union européenne. Hein. Donc, ce que je fais, c'est que Cédric, je te passe la main. Et puis après, vous vous présentez chacun. Et puis voilà, je vous laisse discuter autour de ce sujet passionnant.
Merci Armel. Merci. Okay, merci Armel, thank you very much. So this session will take place in English, right? And well, thank you for being here with us this afternoon. It's a session about sovereignty in Europe, in EU, and we have 4 distinguished speakers with us. So first of all, my name is Cedric Thomas. I run an open source organization founded in Europe called OW2, and I've been recruited to run this roundtable because apparently they could get their act together, all of these 4 of them. So they needed somebody to keep the peace. And so we have Stefane FERMIGIER, Peter GANTEN, Jean-Paul Smith, and Timo VALIHARJU from Finland. So I'm not going to introduce the theme right now, but I think some of them have slides. Who have slides? Yeah, slides and slides. Are they here, the slides?
We sent them to you. So I'm not sure.
Right. Yes, you did. I have them there. And yep. Yeah. Absolutely.
You have them?
Yeah. Just need to find the USB. No, the HDMI. No, the HDMI.
Maybe I can start.
Well, the technique.
Maybe I can.
No, yes, yeah, you will start, but I just want to be ready while you start. Sorry. Is there an HDMI?
Qu'est-ce que vous souhaitez? Non. Ça c'est foutu. Enfin, ça du coup ça ne marche pas. Donc non, c'est pas ça. Donc du coup il y a que ce câble là.
Donc là, enlever de là.
Exactement, c'est ça, oui.
On n'est pas si bien rodé que ça.
Enfin, ce câble HDMI de.
Sorry about that. Okay. Commande L. Right. Okay. Pardon?
Est-ce que vous souhaitez l'image du Mac ou pas?
Pas tout de suite, mais je le prendrai et je le mettrai directement. Okay, we will do a hard connection, and Peter, don't worry, I have your slides here, and they will be presented. Right, enough time wasted. So maybe the first speaker, the speakers will start in this order. So Stefane FERMIGIER is kind of a serial entrepreneur, and he's been around for some time, and he co-founded the CNLL. What's the CNLL? Conseil National des Logiciels Libres, so an organization that represents open source vendors in France, and co-founded APELL, which is the same thing at the European level, and he's been around, and he's a staunch supporter of open source in France and sovereignty. Timo VALIHARJU is been a researcher and teacher in a higher university for 10 years, and also an entrepreneur for 15 years, and has won some sort of recognitions in Finland for that, and is the head of COS in Finland, which is an open source organization that he founded 10 years ago. Peter GANTEN is also an entrepreneur. He's the CEO and founder of Univention that he founded 20 years ago, and which he's been leading ever since. And in 2011, he founded, was it 11? He joined 2 organizations, and he founded OSBA, the Open Source Business Alliance, which is a an organizations in Germany representing open source vendors, which is very similar to the APELL, to the CNLL in France, and both Peter and Stefane joined together to launch APELL, which eventually was joined by COSS and Timo. And so they all Timo co-founder as well? Sorry, I missed that. And Jean-Paul Smith, also a serial entrepreneur and head of Rapid Space, and also a voice of open source in France, and a staunch defender of supporter of Europe-based technology in support of technology, digital sovereignty. So without further ado, I will have to manipulate this quickly and hand over to Stefane when your slides are on.
Thank you very much, Cédric. Quick words of introduction. Who's the CNLL? Who doesn't know the CNLL? Yeah, a couple of people. We are the French association, Conseil National du Logiciel Libre, association of open source companies, not just vendors, but also systems integrators and consulting companies. And our mission is to bring all these companies together and try to be the voice of this sector in France and defend the sector. As you probably know, open source is a big business in Europe, more than 5 billion euros of annual revenue in both France and Germany, and 10 billion euros in the rest of the EU. So just read the studies that we have published. This is an extract of a study we have done 2 or 3 years ago. Of course, there is also the study by the European Commission, which was published this year, and which also has very similar figures and other very important figures. So is France a good place to do open source business? According to this figure in the open source study by the Commission, yes. The public sector rating for France is one of the highest, mostly because of open source competencies in France. Other aspects are good but not perfect. For instance, there is in France the Digital Republic Law that says that the state should encourage the use of open source software within the public administration, but actually it's not really enforced, and that's one of the topics we are really trying to move the things forward. The problem for France, and then we talk about the other countries, but the problem for France is that this figure, the private sector rating, is not very good. It's not the worst, okay, but it's not very good. And it's mostly due to this grade, which is one of the best, and which is actually the existence of a community of business communities of organizations like CNLL and a few other organizations which are very active in France. And if you compare it, for instance, with South Korea, you see that there is a huge gap in terms of support by the government between France and, for instance, South Korea. And this is one of the things that I want to discuss quickly. So we asked our members, the French companies, what do they think? Do they think digital sovereignty is an important subject? The answer is overwhelmingly yes. Do they think that the government is doing everything that they can to encourage open source software or free software? The answer is not so much. So here are the 4 main points on the right. Here. What could they do more? Favor open source in public orders, in public tenders, for instance. Support via an industrial policy the development of the sector. Favor open source SMEs, so a Small Business Act or a European Small Business Act. And there is another question, quite different, but also important for our sector, which is the question of skills, we all have big difficulties recruiting developers or people working in our companies. So according to the Commission, yes, open source and digital sovereignties are related. I just give you a quote from a recent publication, the Open Source Plan, which is called Think Open, which was published I think, last year. But this document is only related to internal use of open source within the Commission. It doesn't say anything about industrial policy. In France, we have the Ministry of Defense, who wrote this very interesting quote in a report published 2 or 3 years ago, which says that an industrial strategy would, around open source, would help France and the EU regain digital sovereignty. This minister, who will give a talk in a few minutes, just over there, she has probably some announcement to make, but she's the minister for public service in France. So she can maybe do something interesting within the public administration. She is not concerned with industrial policies. So what should we do? What should we advocate for? Just in 3 short points: enforce existing regulation. Some countries, including France, have already passed laws or other kind of regulation that either mandate or encourage the use of free software, and currently they are not enforced, or they are not enforced enough. A member of parliament, Philippe Latombe, yesterday said that if the parliament doesn't get involved, the state won't move. They will keep doing business the easiest way for them, which is currently to buy software and services off the shelf from the hyperscalers. Second point, promote our ecosystem. In many countries, and contrary to what's being done, for instance, in South Korea, there is very little promotion of our sector as a thriving ecosystem from the public authorities. And last point, of course, is to finance open source development and maintenance. And I think that's the end for this short introduction. Cedric, I think it's up to you to switch the slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you for these introductory comments, Stefane. And now I'm connecting this guy here.
Okay. I think I will change.
Yeah. And hopefully it will.
How do I switch slides? Just very easy. Yes.
Should be easy.
I can be for no problem.
Very good.
Go spacebar.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Great. So nice to be here. Hello to everyone. My name is Peter. As Cedric already said, an entrepreneur, founder of the or co-founder of the Open Source Business Alliance, and together with Timo and Stefane of APELL, the European Umbrella Association. So I would maybe start with a short definition of digital sovereignty. What is it? I think there are 2 areas, and they are sometimes a little bit confused. One pillar of digital sovereignty is what we call data sovereignty. That's the ability to rule what happens with data you generate while using IT systems, for example, while working with Google Maps or with your iPhone or whatever. And of course, this is also important for data you store in IT systems. This is called data sovereignty, and for some in the discussion, that is digital sovereignty. But from our point of view, at least from my point of view, that's not enough. It's also about the ability to shape and to innovate the IT systems which define our life. If we look at how our life works. Everything is IT. Government is IT, democracy is IT, economy, industries are IT, private communication, education are IT, and we need to be able to define how the processes which rule these communications and these systems work, and so the ability to innovate, the ability to shape is the second pillar. And both together is digital sovereignty. From my point of view, it is not autarky or protectionism. It's not about to keep someone out of Europe. It's about to have a level playing field where we can define for what purpose we use systems we use and shape and innovate on top of them. So yeah, I said this already. Digitization is everywhere. It is important. I think it is really, it will define our future fate. If we are not able to define the processes around us, we will not be able to secure democracy. We will not be able to have a competitive, innovative economy in European countries. That all will be ruled by a few companies, probably most of them not inside Europe, but from my point of view, it's not so much about the point if they are in Europe or not in Europe. It's about the point that they are not controlled in a democratic way, that they just do what they want, and our parliaments, our democracy is not ruling what they do, and that's a big problem. So I think climate change, digital sovereignty are both really fate questions for us we have to work on. So what can we do? We need to invest into open IT infrastructure, open source software. Open hardware is also a big topic we have to think more about. I think in the whole discussion I'm involved in is we are most of the time discussing about software, but hardware is also very important. And to build open cloud systems, open federatable cloud system. We need to strengthen those cloud providers who provide services which really use open source software, which you can replicate, where you can be able to do the same thing in your own data center if you want and if you need to, and where there's not that big vendor lock-in. And I think it is very important that the member states and the European Union itself uses its buying power to promote this. One thing is to have the rules, and the other thing is to spend your money that way, and we don't see this enough right now. So these are some base concepts. Public money, public code, I think everybody has heard it now. It comes from the Free Software Foundation Europe. We need to think of open, permission-free, usable, federable software. We need a strong preference for open source software in public tenders. The public sector gets more if it buys open source software, so it has to be preferred. And if we speak about open standards, they always should have an open source reference implementation. From my point of view, otherwise it does not count as an open standard because it's hard to implement and you have to argue about it. That's it. I didn't know that this was the last slide, but it's a short presentation, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Now, Stefane, if you go back here, we need another preliminary introduction speech. Timo or Jean-Paul? Okay. Jean-Paul, do you have slides?
Well, I decided to change my talk.
Well, so it's all fresh and good. That's
yes.
Good. Those are the best of them.
And yes. Can I connect? Probably.
Yes, if you have the proper.
Ah, yes, I have. Let's try. Okay. Because we are talking about sovereignty and open source, right? Yeah. Okay, does it work? It should work for a couple of seconds due to battery. Okay, should work. A bit fast. So we are talking about open source and sovereignty. And there's one thing people have a problem believing is that open source does have nationality. The idea that open source is international is totally wrong. The source code is owned by a person. It can be an entity like a foundation or a corporation or an individual. But just as with any work, a work is owned by a person. And the person has a nationality and is based in a certain country. And therefore, I will just say it in the most brutal way, just don't use American open source software. Because if you do, you might end up with problem re-exporting your products. For example, imagine you are an industrial company and you want to make machines that you want to export to China. Then you download software from the Apache Foundation. Then you make your machine. And it concludes open source, no problem, from the Apache Foundation. And if you are very unlucky with a crazy president that takes a decision that there should be export restrictions for open source to China for the one he controls, which is the open source software owned by an American organization, then you are fucked up. You cannot export to China, or you have to send the parts without the software and let the Chinese download and assemble. But in a way or another, it's not that convenient. So if you use open source software from Europe rather than open source software from US, and if you are European, you have less risk to face export restrictions. And I think this is a real topic between open source and sovereignty. And in the current world, with America as it is today, and with China as it is today, using open source from US is too dangerous. We will be fucked up with all our exports to China, and China is one of the biggest trade partners, especially for Germany. So we should be very careful. So we see the thing like Chinese developers fear losing open source tech to trade war. It has really become a serious risk. If we want to be positive, because until open source software is owned by US organization, there's basically no hope, because this is military, this is international fights. US has always done these things. They did it with French when we had a problem with our aircraft carrier. They refused to send the part. They did it when we were making our atomic bomb. They refused to send the part. They will always do nasty things to us, European, because we are able to compete a lot with their industry. So we should have absolutely no hope that it won't happen again. But we might want a better world than a world where the software has a nationality, a world where we are afraid whether we can take software A or B based on nationality. That's so stupid, actually, as a world. Then we need to have the open source software owned by organizations in neutral countries, such as Switzerland. And if we really want to build a world where open source is really open source, where Donald Trump cannot block re-export, where Xi Jinping cannot block re-export with one law or another, where we cannot be threatened to go to jail, like Pierucci of Alstom went to jail, we have to make a strong, strong push for open source to be owned by organization, not in France. France also will do these things, but in a neutral country, such as Switzerland. This is what I had to say.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Brief and to the point, as usual. Timo, now over to you for a wrap-up, I mean, your own input and then a conclusion, or before we open up for questions.
I don't. My presentation is probably not here, but that's no problem. I can. Okay, let's see if Cedric can find a presentation, at least to send it on later. But I have it here in my phone. Okay, so my name is Timo VALIHARJU from the Center of Open Systems and Solutions. How are you having it? Yeah, good. And actually, round about the same presentations than the first and the second presenters, so history is almost identical, sort of. Entrepreneur and National Open Source Association, and now with APELL also in the Association of Associations, so to speak. Okay, good. So, yeah. A few words about the situation in Finland. So there was actually very good points in previous presentations, and to start with the digital sovereignty discussion in Finland is that I've been working in open source, open source tech like 22 years or something like that, and previously we were all working with the tech industry or software industry or something like that. And now suddenly, out of nowhere, maybe inspired by Mr. Trump, probably, in Europe, comes to the digital sovereignty, discussion, which actually puts the open source in the political context. Now we actually are something in open source field. Before we were just, the people that made a good job and make a good software, and concept was very interesting, but when you talk about with the politicians and those people that actually decides how we spend money in Finnish government and in Finnish municipalities, there was a little bit empty talk that yeah, it's good, but maybe I will still order some proprietary software because I used to do that. But the discussion is starting now in Finland. So I would say that municipalities are starting to understand that these vendor locks that they are actually in most of the areas are a little bit dangerous. So they are starting to develop open source software together as a community work. One of is this Windows because I use all.
Sorry, it's Google.
Okay, same thing.
I don't use that. I don't know what you do.
Yeah,
Sorry.
but I hope you can.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So this EVACA project is one of the examples of getting out of the vendor lock. So the city of Espoo is developing with a few cities, biggest cities in Finland, ERP for early childhood education. And they are spending maybe 10 million euros to do it. So it's open source, and they are releasing the code to the GitHub. There is an address if somebody wants to go and see. And as ridiculous it sounds, the 10 million euros is actually less than they paid only from the city of Espoo to the proprietary vendors. So the log was horrifying from the taxpayer point of view, at least. And the target is to be used in 60% of Finnish municipalities in later years. And this concept is actually gaining ground in Finland with the municipalities. And of course with COS Association we try to promote that. So they would actually invest all cities certain amount of money to one project, and then there would be a community that will be leading one of the cities. And then they release the code, and we have a possibility to do really open source things there. The problem with the most of the areas in municipalities is that there is no software that they can use that can be taken out of the package, if you know. So here it is, install it, and that's it. And then there you compete with the services and hosting services and all that stuff. But there's a lot of wheels that there is no possibility to do that. So this is probably the only way out of the vendor lock to cooperate with big municipalities and invest together open source software. and after time, it may come to the packaged software that basically can be downloaded and installed maybe in 5 to 10 years or something like that. So when we are thinking about the public tenders, they are just starting to open source solutions in public tenders, but there's a lot of lack of knowledge and courage to tender with open source. And usually they think proprietary when they make tenders in public administration and in municipalities. So if you read about a tender, you see that, okay, it's very difficult to offer as a company because there are elements that are not maybe fit to the open source concept. So that's why the COS is writing actually now a guide to how to buy open source in Finnish municipalities. And I hope that that will help also the municipalities to understand that how to do with open source and how to tender with open source. And we try to also translate in English at some point and of course deliver it all to you if you have a use for that. But it may take a little bit time to do that. But maybe in the spring we can do it. And also a second big thing in Finland is that because the politicians are now really interested because of the concept digital sovereignty. So the department, the Finnish government is publishing a tender that we are also in with COS, that what is the status of open source in Finland and internationally, and they want a recommendation that what is the status of Finnish government when we are talking about open source. So there is a really interest in Prime Minister's office that they should be done something to the area of open source. So from my point of view, last year has been, it has happened a lot more than last 5 previous years together, basically in open source sector in Finland. So now we see that we are in the brink of hype, second coming of open source, so to speak, from my point of view. 5 years ago, I thought that if this ain't going to happen in this area, but now it's happening. So this is my presentation, and feel free to contact me. So it's with 2 S's actually. In the brochure, it's only 1 S. So use 2, then you can find the web page. Thank you.
I'll try to get back to this. Well, thank you very much, all of you. There's one thing that I'm not sure that has really been addressed, is that talking about sovereignty, it's a question of having government making right decisions. That's fair enough. But right decisions is government can define, they can purchase software, they can draft laws and regulations. But the thing is, we need to have something to purchase and something to rule against. So open source being, well, let's face it, the whole software industry is dominated still by North American companies and platform companies. Open source being an avatar of the software industry, it's also dominated by, let's put it this way, North American interests. So it's driven. So we try to balance what we have. And when it comes to big cloud projects, the sovereign cloud and all that, what we have is essentially technologies that are, that are totally controlled or not under the influence of European. We're not digitally sovereign in terms of what technologies we're using, really. So if we don't have the technologies, we can rule the use of these technologies, but eventually that doesn't last because it's who controls and who has the expertise on the technology that will eventually determine what will be the shape of the rules and the usage that will be done ultimately. My take is that you need to control the infrastructure, you need to control the technologies that are in the infrastructure if you can control the usage of the infrastructure. If you don't control the infrastructure, you may rule how whatever as to run and how the structure of the application running on the infrastructure will be. Eventually that will fade out, that will be worn, that will become obsolete, and the technology will be, it's who controls the technology that controls the usage eventually. So that would be my take on digital sovereignty, and I would like to have your opinion on this perspective. Well, Stefane was first, and then Peter.
as I explained in one of the slides, according to the well-regarded studies, the European open source industry is about 10% of the European IT industry. So that's quite already a big figure. Everything or almost everything exists already as open source, not necessarily European open source. And on this matter, I don't fully agree with Jean-Paul's warning. Of course, if you are, for instance, a software vendor who will select open source software and needs to export to China or to Iran or to countries which could really prove problematic with respect to the US policies or maybe another country's policy, then you have to be very careful. But if you are a French or European ministry or a municipality, you can use software that's maybe developed in Europe, it's probably better, or develop worldwide, or develop in another continent, and use local resources, local specialists, either systems integrator or local. We used to, I don't know if the word is still used, but VARs, value added resellers. That means people that are not necessarily the primary author of a software, in this occurrence an open source software, but who can really add value, local value, and have probably the necessary autonomy to make the software work for the long term.
Okay, good point.
Yes.
Peter?
Regarding to your question, there has to be something to purchase. True. And I think that this is really a challenge. I don't, to be honest, I don't agree with this concept that we must program everything from scratch in Europe again. What would that mean? That means don't use Linux. I think then we are doomed. And I think, I'm not sure if I agree with, if I download something, I have no agreement with the US state. And I download it under a specific license, and I can do with it whatever I want. There is no ruling. Maybe the vendor of the software has a problem, but I don't. And okay, do it. But the thing is, we need to build capacity, and we need to build more people who understand this code. I think we don't need a Chinese, an American, and a European operating system, and a Chinese, European cloud management system, and whatever. We need people who understand it, who can work with it, who can shape it. And if this should happen, and we for some reason are not allowed to work with the Chinese or with the colleagues in the US, who are smart, by the way, too, and it's fun to work with them, and we should work with them if it's possible, then we will be able to do it on our own. And I think there are a number of measures we can apply here. For example, public funding, public research funding. Why do we fund proprietary projects with public money? We shouldn't. And and that's the success story of the Silicon Valley. They funded the internet and they made it free. And then they had people who were smart, who built it, and who knew what to do and who could use it. And that's the way how all these companies started there. And we should try the same thing here.
Well, this is the notion of the ecosystem. You have to have the basic technologies and people to
but we
build
don't need new technologies. We need the skills and the capacity.
Okay.
So now,
Jean-Paul.
So I absolutely agree. We don't need new technologies because absolutely everything already exists made by European companies in open source, not one time, but 5 times. And So, and of course, everything also exists made in US. The structure of the market is a little bit different in US or in Europe, but roughly we are still in a 50% creation of code between Europe and US. And if you say we can't buy, that's not true. We can buy absolutely everything in Europe. So I'll give you an example. We want to do cloud infrastructure. You'll be surprised of my example, but who is the absolute #1 in terms of doing business cloud in open source in the world? In terms of deployments, how many companies are using it? A software that you can see all over the world, that so many people install, is easy to use and is fun and European. Can you guess? Sorry? No, a cloud software to manage virtual machines, storage, all these things. Can you guess? No? Proxmox, yes. You'll find it everywhere, in Iran, in China, absolutely everywhere. So it's just one example, but people forget it. Sure, it doesn't sound like the big B2B software and so on, but it's used by tens of thousands of small companies who are happy with it, and it's not VMware, it's Proxmox, and they use it as they would use VMware, and they are happy. And for what it does it. It's not, and it's not my company, and maybe the CEO is, some people say, strange. He didn't want, it's hard to talk sometimes to talk with him, but he made a good product sold worldwide. And things like that, we have dozens. For example, you want something to design websites, like for user experience. So what do you use when you design a website as an online system? Give me the famous name. Sorry? Figma. Yes. What are the 2 European equivalent? One proprietary, one open source. You have hard, it's hard. Sketch and Pen and Pot. Pen and Pot is from Spain, it's open source. Sketch is from Netherlands. And for every name, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 European companies. They are small, but they do exist. And when you buy from them, the good part is you take the train, you can talk to the guys. You know, as a French, I'm not German, but as a French, when I meet American companies, they treat me like an African. I really feel, or Turkish, I don't know how you'd say, but I'm always treated bad, like I'm treated like a wine and cheese guy, not as an engineer. I'm not respected as a business or engineer because I'm not German. It's different when you are German. So, when I go to meet a Spanish or a German or Belgian, we have more culture, it's easier to talk, they will not give low priority to my request. It's good to have people nearby to help. Of course, we also work remotely with companies in the US, but we have them in Europe, no problem. Then about this export issue, it's a very subtle problem. The people who are governments European governments can download code from a US foundation, use it, no problem. Companies in Europe can download code, use it in Europe, no problem. The only trick is if you embed it in a product, then the product, you re-export it, for example, to your factories in China, something very important for German industry, because the machine tools in China are most of them Germans. Then that stuff, when you ship to China Industry 4.0 systems, then you get an issue with the export control restriction of US government. Just in that very specific case, but this case is very important for German economy because most of the machine tools in China are shipped like that. And
okay, we're back to the early arguments you made in the slides.
And I really think that we should make all sure that this stops.
Now, what I want to say is that we do have the technology, and the problem is that the money does not go necessarily to that technology.
Yes.
The decisions are not made in favor of this technology.
Absolutely.
And all that. And there is a way, I have to share my own experience with OW2. When we launched OW2 15 years ago, people were only talking about these North American foundations, and they could not understand that there would be a European-based open source foundation. And what we're doing is we're trying to promote open source software vendors of European origin. And still, we are a niche player, so we do our job well, but we don't like ideas, we don't like quality technologies, We do things that even the North American organizations don't do. We invent things even in terms of governance, etc. So we have nothing to be ashamed of, neither in terms of open source community, open source technologies available, or expertise, or governance. We do open source, we know how to do open source, we can do open source, and we can be totally sovereign. The only thing is, open source only represents between 10 and 50% of the market, and most of the software we use and the market power and the money is spent on proprietary software, and the attention of all the people who have the resources and the power is attracted by proprietary software. So we only on the fringe of the market. So that's what makes it probably difficult for us. That's the way I see it.
Yeah,
Timo,
one problem also is that most of the open source companies are not that very good making business. They are very good of making tech and technology, but the business side is lacking. Or when you are comparing to the US companies, they go business first and then they do something with technology. We do great technology, but then we forgot to do the business. So we have to also look about our ecosystems and our ways of working with software and the business. So, and second comment is maybe the competence log. In some areas there is none, because there's a lot of companies that are doing certain open source softwares like in Drupal or some other communities. But then when you go a little bit more extraordinary areas of business, let's say daycare system or hospital systems, there is no open source software that actually could have a community that you can rely on your business. Because if you rely on a community that actually dies away like 5 years, you are a really serious problem. We need to grow the communities in order to make better business, and that's the lesson I've learned in my businesses. So trust the wrong community, and it's not nice anymore.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think it's time to open up for the floor, question to the floor, and maybe at the end of, words to the back? Yes. Or Leslie, go on. Short.
I'll make it very short. So
Please.
first of all, you're correct. Americans are terrified of Germans because we all grew up watching Indiana Jones movies. So you're absolutely correct, sir. Absolutely serious, no bullshit question. I agree with you that it is of concern, U.S. export control and ITAR, but how are we ever to necessarily assume that some kind of inept fascist regime is not going to take over in Europe? I mean, like, that is, if the problem is that we have no protection for people based on like sovereign laws and how developers will be punished, or systems integrators or whoever will be punished for the way they're using software, like that can happen here too. I live in Germany, the AfD exists. I will only speak of the place where I currently reside. I mean, that's a real problem.
Who wants to answer?
So you have just proven that there will be US export control. That's what you said.
US export control and ITAR 100% exist today.
Yeah, they will always be.
Tell me why you can prove to me that European export controls are never going to exist.
There will be also too, same, okay. And Chinese too.
So then doesn't that argue for creating the capacity?
The only there's no everybody spies everybody. Everybody tries to do export control on everybody. It's the same everybody. But if I'm a French equipment manufacturer and I want to sell to China, I don't want to face US export control. It's a practical thing. If I'm a US manufacturer and I don't want to get European export control, then better use American technology, else I might get European export control. So all I'm saying is this game of everybody trying to put export control, until it is solved, because it's nonsense for open source, has to be taken care of. That's all.
Okay, thanks. Thanks. Another question.
Hi, everyone. Just a question about... you talk a lot about, it's a question to all of you as entrepreneurs, and both entrepreneurs and open source advocates. And you talk a lot about investing money and asking for more money or more targeting by the state. But it's hard for me if I look at the past 20 years in technology and the expansion of North American technologies. It went together with a cultural way of work, of organization. I'm not very erudite about that, but I can think about lean startups or open data for governments, stuff like that came with open source, that came with software. And I wonder if we are not a little bit too pragmatic about open source in Europe, as it's about money, about building more software, about this, and not having a cultural proposition going together with that. So as entrepreneurs in your companies, do you, both when you promote open source, do you also promote some kind of transparency policies or open data policies or things that comes with open source and that could help Europe take like the forefront of this kind of movement? That was my question.
Thanks. Okay, thank you. So the question is, as an open source vendor, do you also promote the ethical and the values that comes with open source and the ideology and the benefits? Peter, you wanted to reply to that?
I think this is, of course, the story which is behind all of what we are doing. We had a free decision to build companies on top of open source software. And we had a reason for this. And the reason, so we are not arguing for open source software because by some obscure accident our companies are doing open source software and now we are finding arguments to sell it. It's the other way around. We decided to do open source because of the values behind it. And I think And that's what scares me here. An important point of open source software is cooperation and is also international cooperation and is working together on an international basis and learning those good concepts from the US. They had a few very bright ideas and we should adapt them. And we have also good ideas and they should adapt them if they want. If they don't, they don't have to. And so yes, that is the opportunity that we can build software which gives digital sovereignty, ability to control and to shape to organizations and other states. And I think this will enable us to build products not only for ourselves, but also for other countries.
And, I completely agree with what Peter said. I would like to add something. CNLL has been founded on these very premises that shared values between our members are important. It's part of our mission statement, which I think I projected at the beginning of my talk. It's also something we've been working on, because just saying we have shared values or we share the values of free software and open source it's good, but it's just not enough. We have to precisely define what these values are, or they can also converge with other important topics in the current political debate, like sustainability, green IT, and so on, or also inclusion and so on, or inclusivity. I don't know the term the exact term. We're working on this, and this year we published a study, which is on our website, the CNLL study, and a big part of it, I don't know, 40 pages, is about this question of values, and we are going to try to make it more operational by writing a charter that our companies will sign if they want, of course, if they agree with it. We have already done a similar work 8 years ago with regard to employment, and we want to make it a bit more general and to include some of these other ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah, just
okay.
Very quick, because I want to have a word of conclusion.
Yes.
On the economies. You go.
Just to reassure Peter, I hate myself the nationalism and restrictions. Therefore, I plan to move my code to Switzerland. Really, because I don't trust any country nowadays not to enforce export restrictions. Then I hope everyone will do that.
Thank you.
Well, that's.
But you trust us first.
Who else?
Okay, Cédric, for the.
That's another possibility.
For the final word.
Okay. Okay, well, that's a nice twist to finish. I wanted to close on the fact that open source software was creating local jobs, which were good for our economies, good jobs with high purchasing power that cannot be delocalized to other continents, and that was also the economics of open source works. And I agree with Peter. If we do business in open source, we don't do business for profit maximizing motives, but also for ethical motives, because when you look at the actual results of companies, you look at Microsoft results and the Oracle results, the net profit is 25%. Net 25%. So in terms of dozens of billions of dollars of net money that can be spent for shareholders, etc. Now, that don't go to wage earners. But when you look at the open source vendors, their profit rate the net is between 10 and 15%. Red Hat, the last one I could read from Red Hat was 15%. And 15% was the best, and Red Hat is a model in terms of business model and successful open source company. So 15%, but it's reasonable. It's in this capitalist world. 10-15% is not abusive. It's not. It does not preempt money from the consumers or from the users. It's standard so that you can guarantee the sustainability of the company. So I think open source is healthy. Much healthier for everyone, creates good jobs, and it's also part of this kind of sovereignty we're talking about. So it's between finding frontiers, and developing our own resources. That's all. It's a bit of a complex topic, and we'll be back on it certainly.
Thank you very much for this conclusion, and thank you to all of you for this very interesting debate.
Thanks, Armel.
Thank you.